The morning air in Dodge City carried the bite of late October, 1887, sharp enough to make honest folks pull their coats tight and hurry about their business. Samuel Morrison sat on the weathered bench outside Murphy's saloon, a folded letter resting carefully in his weathered hands. His gray hair caught the pale sunlight beneath a worn black hat, and his simple brown coat had seen better decades. The lines carved deep in his face spoke of 70-odd years, most of them spent under the brutal Kansas sun. The letter bore a feminine hand, the ink still fresh enough to catch the light. Samuel read each word slowly, his pale gray eyes moving with the careful precision of a man who understood that some communications deserved complete attention. Around him, Dodge City stirred to life with the familiar sounds of commerce and conversation, but he remained still as carved stone. Thunder rolled from the east, but it carried the rhythm of hoofbeats rather than storm clouds. 6 riders emerged through the morning haze, their horses lathered and their faces hard with the particular cruelty that comes from too much power and too few consequences. The leader sat his mount like a man who owned the world, his black duster flowing behind him like the wings of some carrion bird. A silver star hung from his belt, not legitimate law but stolen authority, and his right hand rested easy on the grip of a well-used Colt. Black Jack Malone had earned his reputation the honest way, through blood and brutality across 3 territories. The 5 men who rode with him shared the same casual violence, the same dead eyes that marked predators who had never met their match. As they dismounted in front of Murphy's, conversations died like snuffed candles. Shopkeepers found urgent business indoors. Children vanished into doorways. The old man on the bench never looked up from his letter. Black Jack's spurs rang against the boardwalk planks as he approached, each step deliberate and threatening. He stopped directly in front of Samuel, close enough that his shadow fell across the carefully folded paper. "Boy," he said, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're in my spot." Samuel finished the paragraph he was reading before responding. "I'll be done shortly, friend. Just finishing some correspondence." The outlaw's face darkened like a gathering storm. "Nobody tells Black Jack Malone to wait, old man. This here's my town, and that there's my bench." Without warning, Black Jack leaned forward and spat directly onto Samuel's right boot, the tobacco-stained saliva marking the worn leather like a brand of contempt. The street fell silent as death. Samuel Morrison slowly raised his pale gray eyes and looked at Black Jack Malone for the first time. Those pale gray eyes held something that made Black Jack Malone take an involuntary step backward, though his pride wouldn't let him retreat further. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Samuel's gaze never wavered, never blinked, carrying the weight of winter storms and distant graves. "What's so all-fired important in that letter, old man?" Black Jack demanded, his voice carrying a forced bravado that fooled no one, least of all himself. "You act like it's gospel straight from the Almighty." Samuel carefully folded the letter and placed it inside his coat pocket. "Personal correspondence," he said quietly. "Nothing that concerns you." But Black Jack had already moved, his hand shooting out to snatch the paper before Samuel could secure it completely. The outlaw's fingers closed around the letter with the practiced speed of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. He stepped back, unfolding the delicate paper with theatrical flourish. "Well, now let's just see what's got the old buzzard so interested," Black Jack announced to his gang, his voice carrying across the empty street. "Maybe it's a love letter from some toothless widow." His eyes scanned the feminine handwriting, and his mocking expression began to shift as he read the opening lines aloud. "Dear Mr. Morrison, I hope this letter finds you in good health and peaceful circumstances. I wanted to write and thank you personally for the justice you brought to those who murdered my husband." The gang members exchanged glances, their easy confidence wavering like candle flames in a sudden breeze. Black Jack continued reading, but his voice had lost its jeering tone. "Thomas always spoke of you with the greatest respect during his years as a United States Marshal. He often said that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped you would be the one to set things right." Samuel sat motionless on the bench, his weathered hands resting calmly on his knees, but something in his posture had changed. The elderly frailty seemed to be falling away like a discarded coat, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath. The work you did in Tombstone last month was swift and thorough, Blackjack read on, his voice growing uncertain. Sheriff Bean told me you tracked those 7 men across 200 miles of desert. He said they never had a chance once you picked up their trail. Thomas would have been proud to see justice served with such precision. Young Deputy Fletcher stood frozen across the street, his face pale as winter snow. His hand trembled as he recognized something in the old man's bearing, some detail that transformed everything he thought he understood about the situation unfolding before his eyes. Blackjack's hands shook slightly as he continued reading. The money you refused for completing this work has been donated to the Territorial Marshal's Widow Fund, as you requested. Thomas always said you never took blood money, that justice was payment enough. I pray that God grants you the peace you seek in your retirement, and I hope the nightmares fade with time. Your grateful friend, Margaret Williams. The letter crackled in the sudden silence as Blackjack crumpled it in his fist. His face had flushed red with embarrassment and anger at being made to look foolish in front of his men. He threw the wadded paper into the dirt at Samuel's feet and shoved the old man hard in the chest, sending him tumbling backward off the bench. You think you're something special, old-timer? Blackjack snarled. But there was something desperate in his voice now, like a cornered animal trying to convince itself it was still the predator. Some washed-up has been playing at being tough? But before you find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this tale of justice and hidden legends, hit that like button. And if you're not subscribed yet, make sure to join us for more stories of the untamed frontier. Comment what country you're listening from. I love seeing how these stories of the American West travel across the world. Now, stay with me because what's coming next will surprise you. Samuel rose slowly from the dusty street, brushing the dirt from his worn coat with methodical care. His movements were fluid now, lacking the careful hesitation of old age. Pick up that letter, son, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of distant thunder. Blackjack laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty buildings. Or what, Grandpa? You'll lecture me to death? He kicked dirt deliberately onto the crumpled paper, grinding it under his boot heel. Across the street, Deputy Fletcher grabbed the arm of townsman Harold Kemp and whispered something urgent in his ear. Kemp's eyes went wide with terror, and he began backing toward the nearest doorway. The recognition was spreading like wildfire through the few brave souls still watching from windows and doorways. The name Samuel Morrison meant something in these parts, something that turned grown men's blood to ice water and made hardened outlaws reconsider their life choices. But Blackjack Malone was too proud and too stupid to read the signs that were screaming danger all around him. Deputy Fletcher's whispered words carried across the street like a death sentence. Dear God in heaven, he breathed to Harold Kemp, his voice trembling with recognition and terror. That's Samuel Morrison. That's the Reaper of Dodge City. Kemp's face drained of all color, leaving him pale as bleached bone. The hardware store owner had heard the stories, the legends whispered in saloons from Kansas to California. Every man, woman, and child in the territories knew that name, knew what it meant when someone mentioned the Reaper in hushed, reverent tones. The recognition spread like wildfire through the scattered observers. Mrs. Patterson dropped her marketing basket and fled toward the church. Old Pete abandoned his post outside the barber shop and hobbled away as fast as his arthritic legs could carry him. Even the horses seemed to sense something terrible brewing, stamping nervously and pulling at their hitching posts. Blackjack noticed the exodus, his confidence wavering as he watched his audience disappear. What's got everyone so spooked? He demanded, but his voice lacked its earlier swagger. The street was emptying faster than a plague house, and only his 5 men remained within sight. Samuel bent down and carefully retrieved the crumpled letter from the dirt, smoothing out the wrinkles with gentle reverence. As he straightened, something profound transformed in his bearing. The stooped shoulders squared themselves with military precision. The trembling hands grew steady as mountain stone. The hesitant shuffle became the measured stride of a man who had walked through hell and emerged victorious. When Samuel Morrison looked up again, Blackjack Malone found himself staring into the eyes of death itself. My name is Samuel Morrison, the old man said, and his voice carried the weight of distant thunder rolling across empty plains. Some folks call me the Reaper. The words hit Blackjack's gang like physical blows. 3 of the 6 outlaws immediately began backing away from their leader, their hands moving instinctively away from their weapons. They knew the stories. Every gunfighter worth his salt knew the legend of the Reaper, the man who had cleaned out entire gangs single-handed and lived to tell about it. 43 confirmed kills, Samuel continued, his voice never rising above conversational tone. All justified. All necessary. All men who chose violence over justice. Just like you boys here today. Black Jack's hand twitched toward his gun, but something in Morrison's posture froze him mid-motion. This wasn't the fumbling old codger he'd been bullying moments before. This was something else entirely, something that belonged in the darkest nightmares of violent men. I trained Wyatt Earp in Wichita, Samuel said, his pale eyes never leaving Black Jack's face. Taught Doc Holliday the difference between fast and accurate. Wild Bill Hickok asked me to teach him precision shooting, but I was too busy cleaning up the Apache Canyon Gang that summer. The Apache Canyon Gang, whispered Jake Hartwell, one of Black Jack's men. His face had gone white as fresh snow. Boss, that was 15 men. They say he took them all down in one afternoon. 15 years I've been retired, Samuel continued, his voice growing colder with each word. 15 years since I hung up my guns and tried to find peace. 15 years since I killed my last man and swore I was done with violence. But Black Jack Malone was too proud for his own good, too invested in his reputation to back down in front of his men. He straightened his shoulders and tried to summon his earlier bravado. You're bluffing, old man. The Reaper's been dead for years. Everyone knows that. Samuel's transformation was complete now. Gone was any trace of the frail, elderly man who had been reading his letter peacefully. In his place stood something carved from winter ice and tempered steel, a living weapon that had been sleeping for 15 years but never truly forgotten how to kill. You spat on my boot, boy, Samuel said, and the temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees. His voice carried the finality of a gravestone epitaph. That was your first mistake. Your last mistake will be not walking away when I give you the chance. 3 more of Black Jack's men began edging backward, their survival instincts overriding loyalty to their leader. Only 2 remained flanking Black Jack now, and both looked ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. The stories were true then. All of them. The Reaper was real, and he was standing right here in the middle of Dodge City's main street, offering them one last chance to choose life over death. Samuel Morrison reached up and removed his worn black hat, revealing silver hair that caught the morning light like spun platinum. When he placed the hat carefully on the bench behind him, every man present understood they were witnessing a ritual, a ceremony that marked the end of peace and the beginning of war. The Reaper had awakened from his long sleep, and Black Jack Malone had only himself to blame for disturbing the monster's rest. Samuel Morrison unbuttoned his worn brown coat with deliberate precision, each movement calculated and purposeful. Beneath the faded fabric, 2 gun belts crossed his chest in an X pattern, the leather dark with age and use. The holsters rode high and tight against his ribs, positioned for a cross draw that would bring both weapons into action simultaneously. The Colt peacemakers that emerged were works of deadly art. The grips bore intricate carving work, worn smooth by decades of handling, and the barrels gleamed with the blue-black finish of perfectly maintained steel. Initials were carved into each grip, faded but still visible in the morning light. SM on the right, YM on the left, marking these weapons as both tools and memorial. Black Jack Malone watched this revelation with growing panic, but his pride had trapped him in a corner of his own making. Too many men had witnessed his confrontation with the old-timer. Too much reputation rode on this moment. He couldn't back down now without losing everything he'd built through years of fear and intimidation. The outlaw's hand moved toward his gun with desperate speed, fingers closing around the familiar grip of his Colt. But panic made him sloppy, pride made him reckless, and fear made him slow when he needed to be fast. His draw was ragged, hurried, lacking the smooth precision that separated professionals from pretenders. The shot echoed across Dodge City like thunder, but the bullet went wide, striking the saloon wall 3 feet from Morrison's head. Black Jack had rushed his aim, pulled the trigger too soon, committed every amateur mistake that separated living gunfighters from dead ones. Samuel Morrison never drew his weapons. He simply stepped to his left with fluid grace, moving like water flowing around a stone. The motion was economical, precise, wasting no energy on dramatic flourishes. 43 men. Boy, he said calmly, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather. You think you're the first to try? The remaining gang members began spreading out across the street, trying to use numbers and positioning to overwhelm their opponent. It was sound tactical thinking against an ordinary adversary, but Samuel Morrison was anything but ordinary. His pale gray eyes tracked each man's movement with the detached interest of a chess master studying pawns on a board. Jake Hartwell moved to the left, seeking cover behind a water trough. Tommy Brennan circled right toward the hitching post. Frank Delaney remained behind Black Jack, hands hovering near his guns, but not yet committed to the fight. The three smart ones had already retreated to safe distance, understanding that proximity to this confrontation meant proximity to death. Morrison's mind cataloged distances, angles, cover positions, and escape routes with the automatic precision of long experience. 30 feet to Hartwell, clear line of sight but partial cover available. 25 feet to Brennan, exposed position but good angle for crossfire. 15 feet to Delaney, nervous disposition suggesting he would hesitate when action began. Black Jack at 12 feet, reloading with shaking hands, no longer the primary threat. The street had become a killing ground, and Samuel Morrison was the architect of everything that would happen next. His hands moved with speed that defied human perception, crossing to the twin Colts in a draw so smooth it seemed choreographed. The weapons appeared in his hands as if by magic, hammers cocked, barrels aligned with mathematical precision. No wasted motion, no theatrical spinning, just the practiced economy of a man who had performed this deadly dance 43 times before. The first shot took Black Jack's gun right out of his hand, the bullet striking the cylinder and sending the weapon spinning away into the dirt. The impact broke two of the outlaw's fingers, and he screamed in pain and shock as blood began flowing from the mangled digits. The second shot put a hole through Jake Hartwell's hat without disturbing a hair on his head, the bullet passing so close to his scalp that he felt the heat of its passage. The message was unmistakably clear. Morrison could have killed him just as easily as frightening him. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, his voice carrying the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you have a choice to make. Drop your weapons and ride out of Dodge City, or join the 43 who chose poorly before you." Tommy Brennan's nerve broke first. The young outlaw's gun hit the dirt with a metallic clatter, followed immediately by his hands reaching for the sky. Frank Delaney hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds before following suit, his weapons joining the growing collection in the street dust. But Jake Hartwell was made of different stuff, the kind of stupid courage that got men killed in situations like this. He rolled from behind the water trough, guns blazing, trusting in speed and desperation to carry him through where skill had failed his companions. Morrison moved like smoke in a high wind, flowing away from Hartwell's wild shots with the grace of a man who had danced this dance many times before. His return fire was surgical in its precision, placing one bullet through Hartwell's right shoulder and another through his left thigh. The wounds were deliberately non-fatal but utterly disabling, dropping the outlaw to the street where he writhed in agony. "Professional," Morrison said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "That's the difference between killing and stopping, between murder and justice, between 43 dead men and 43 necessary deaths." Black Jack Malone clutched his ruined hand against his chest, staring at the legend who had destroyed his gang with less effort than most men spent swatting flies. The Reaper stood among his defeated enemies like an avenging angel, twin Colts still smoking in the morning air, proving that some men were simply born to be instruments of divine justice. Black Jack Malone pressed his bleeding hand against his coat, using pain and rage to fuel one last desperate gambit. The three men who had fled earlier crept back into position, drawn by misplaced loyalty or simple stupidity. They took cover behind buildings and water barrels, spreading out along the street with the coordination of men who had run many fights together. "You think this is over, Reaper?" Black Jack snarled through gritted teeth, his face twisted with agony and humiliation. "I got 6 good men here, and you're just one old buzzard with fancy guns. Numbers tell, even against legends. Samuel Morrison stood in the center of the street, reloading his Colts with practiced efficiency. Each cartridge slid home with mechanical precision, muscle memory from decades of violence guiding his movements. When he looked up at Black Jack, his pale gray eyes held no anger, no hatred, just the cold calculation of a predator assessing prey. "I came to Dodge City for peace, boy," Morrison said, his voice carrying across the empty street like distant thunder. "I came here to read a letter from a dead friend's widow and remember better times. You brought me war." The gang opened fire from multiple positions simultaneously, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the morning light. Lead flew through the air where Morrison had been standing, but the Reaper was already gone, moving like smoke in a high wind, flowing from cover to cover with the fluid grace of a man who had survived 4 decades of gunfights. Morrison rolled behind a water trough as bullets chewed splinters from the wood above his head. His mind automatically cataloged the positions of his enemies. 2 men on the roof of Henderson's Dry Goods, one behind the corner of the bank building, one using the blacksmith's anvil for cover, and 2 more firing from windows in the hotel across the street. 6 men with good positions and adequate cover, but they were thinking like outlaws instead of soldiers. They were shooting to kill rather than shooting to control ground, wasting ammunition on wild shots instead of coordinated fire. Morrison had seen this pattern before, 43 times, and it always ended the same way. He moved with surgical precision, using every scrap of cover the street provided. A quick dash to the horse trough put him in position to engage the rooftop shooters. 2 precise shots from his left-hand Colt sent both men tumbling from their perch, their screams cut short by the impact with the street below. The man behind the bank building tried to rush Morrison's position while he was reloading, but the Reaper had anticipated the move. His right-hand Colt spoke once, and the would-be flanker dropped like a stone, clutching his chest as blood spread across his dirty shirt. From the hotel window, Tommy Brennan's brother Eddie opened up with a shotgun, the buckshot chewing chunks from the water trough, but finding only empty air. Morrison had already moved, circling wide to approach the building from an unexpected angle. He put 2 shots through the window, and Eddie Brennan's cries announced another threat eliminated. Frank Delaney, who had surrendered earlier, made the fatal mistake of reaching for his discarded weapon. Morrison's response was immediate and final, a single shot that proved why men called him the Reaper. Delaney collapsed beside his gun, his gambling days permanently ended. That left only Jake Hartwell, still writhing wounded in the street, but reaching for a hideout gun in his boot. Morrison's bullet shattered the Derringer before Hartwell could clear leather, leaving the outlaw truly defenseless for the first time in his violent life. Black Jack watched his gang die with growing horror, finally understanding that he was witnessing something beyond ordinary gunfighting. This wasn't a battle between equals. It was an execution carried out by a master craftsman who had perfected his art through decades of practice. In desperation, Black Jack stumbled toward the hotel, his wounded hand leaving a trail of blood drops in the dust. He kicked open the door and grabbed Mrs. Patterson, who had been cowering behind the front desk. The elderly woman screamed as he pressed his backup gun against her temple, using her frail body as a shield. "Let's see how fast you are when innocent blood is at stake, Reaper," Black Jack shouted, backing toward the staircase with his hostage held tight against his chest. "Drop those guns, or the old woman dies." Samuel Morrison stepped through the hotel doorway, his Colts still smoking from their recent work. When he looked at Black Jack Malone now, something had changed in his expression. The cold professionalism was still there, but underneath it burned something altogether more dangerous. "Boy," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You just made this personal." The difference between a gunfighter and a killer, Morrison continued, moving slowly up the stairs as Black Jack retreated, is that a gunfighter shoots at other gunfighters. A killer shoots at anyone he pleases. I've spent 40 years making sure I stayed on the right side of that line. Black Jack's gun trembled against Mrs. Patterson's head as he backed up the stairs, his wounded hand leaving bloody prints on the banister. "Stay back," he screamed, but his voice cracked with fear. "I'll do it. I'll kill her." "No," Morrison replied with absolute certainty, "you won't." The shot came faster than human thought could follow, Morrison's bullet threading the needle between hostage and capped her with mathematical precision. Black Jack's gun flew from his grip as the bullet shattered his wrist, and Mrs. Patterson collapsed to the floor in shock, but unharmed. Black Jack Malone tumbled down the stairs, both hands now ruined, his gunfighting days permanently ended. He landed in a heap at Morrison's feet, looking up at the legend who had destroyed everything he had built through years of intimidation and violence. "This is how it ends for men like you," Morrison said, his twin Colts trained on Black Jack's chest. Not in a blaze of glory, not in some romantic last stand, but broken and bleeding in the dust, finally learning that there's always someone faster, someone better, someone more committed to justice than you are to evil. Black Jack made one final desperate reach for Morrison's gun, a last pathetic attempt to die with some shred of dignity intact. Morrison's response was measured, professional, and absolutely final. The shot echoed through the hotel lobby, and Black Jack Malone's reign of terror ended forever. Samuel Morrison stood among the bodies of 6 dead outlaws, methodically reloading his Colts with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the fight. The street was quiet now except for the whisper of wind through the building and the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats as word of the gunfight spread across the territory. The Reaper had returned to Dodge City, and everyone would remember this day as the moment when legend became reality once again. Samuel Morrison walked slowly back to the bench outside Murphy's saloon, his twin Colts now holstered but still warm from their deadly work. 6 bodies lay scattered across Dodge City's main street, testament to what happened when evil men pushed a living legend too far. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the fallen outlaws like grasping fingers. He sat down heavily on the weathered bench and carefully retrieved the crumpled letter from his coat pocket. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out the wrinkles, not from age or infirmity, but from the familiar aftermath of violence. Even after 43 kills, even after 4 decades of justified shooting, taking a life still extracted its price from Samuel Morrison's soul. The letter bore the careful script of Margaret Williams, widow of U.S. Marshal Thomas Williams, but as Samuel read the words again, tears began forming in his pale gray eyes. The townspeople emerging from their hiding places couldn't know the full truth, couldn't understand why the legendary Reaper had come to Dodge City on this particular morning. Margaret Williams had been Margaret Morrison once, Samuel's beloved wife for 37 years before consumption took her gentle soul. Her brother Thomas had been the finest lawman Samuel had ever known, a man who believed in justice and mercy in equal measure. When Thomas was murdered by Black Jack's gang during a routine prisoner transport, Margaret had written to the one man she knew could set things right. Samuel read her final words through a haze of grief and memory. "I pray that God grants you the peace you seek in your retirement, Samuel, and I hope the nightmares fade with time. Thomas is buried beside me now in the Topeka Cemetery, and we both rest easier knowing that justice has been served. This is my final letter, dear brother. The doctors say my time is short, but I wanted to thank you one last time for being the good man my husband always said you were." Sheriff William Masterson arrived with 3 deputies, their faces grim as they surveyed the carnage in the street. The lawman approached Samuel cautiously, hand resting on his gun, but making no threatening moves. Morrison reached into his coat and produced a tarnished silver badge, still valid despite 15 years of retirement. "Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison," he said quietly, handing Masterson the badge. "Black Jack Malone and his gang murdered Marshal Thomas Williams 6 weeks ago during a prisoner transport near Abilene. I tracked them here to serve the warrants for their arrest." Masterson examined the badge carefully, noting the authentic engravings and federal seal. The paperwork was in order, the authority legitimate, but everyone present understood that justice had been served with bullets rather than handcuffs. "Dead or alive, Marshal Morrison," Masterson said finally. "The warrants all say dead or alive." "They chose dead," Samuel replied, tucking the badge back into his coat. "I gave them every chance to surrender." Witnesses began emerging from buildings and doorways, confirming Samuel's account of the confrontation. Black Jack had started the fight, had threatened innocent lives, had refused multiple opportunities to walk away. Under territorial law, Marshal Morrison had acted within his authority and his rights. The town council convened an emergency meeting that afternoon, formally thanking Samuel for ridding Dodge City of its most persistent threat. Mayor Henderson offered him the position of town marshal, promising good pay and a comfortable life enforcing local law. "I'm retired, gentlemen," Samuel said, though his refusal was gentle. "I came here to finish one last piece of business, not to start a new career. The killing stops here." That evening, Samuel walked alone to Dodge City's cemetery, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers he had purchased from Mrs. Patterson, who was still shaken but grateful to be alive. He found the newest section of the graveyard and knelt beside a simple wooden cross marked with fresh carving. "Sarah Morrison, beloved wife, 18201-887. Sarah had been Samuel's anchor to humanity, the gentle soul who had reminded him that he was more than just a weapon in human form. She had never seen him kill, never witnessed the cold efficiency that made him legendary, but she had held him through countless nightmares and helped him bear the weight of necessary violence. "I kept my promise, Sarah," he whispered, placing the flowers at the base of her grave. "Thomas is avenged, and the men who killed him will never hurt anyone else. But I'm tired, sweetheart. So very tired of being the Reaper." 3 months later, Dodge City had transformed into a peaceful community where families felt safe to walk the streets after dark. Samuel Morrison had taken a small room above Henderson's store and spent his days reading, fishing, and avoiding the whiskey that called to him in moments of darkness. His presence alone was enough to discourage troublemakers, though he never again drew his guns in anger. Young Deputy Fletcher often stopped by to talk with the living legend, asking questions about famous gunfighters and legendary lawmen. Samuel answered carefully, emphasizing tactics and law enforcement rather than the romance of violence. "The law is about protecting people, boy," he would say, "not about proving how fast you can kill." 5 years later, a delegation of territorial marshals arrived in Dodge City with an unusual request. Crime was spreading across the frontier faster than experienced lawmen could contain it, and they needed someone to train a new generation of peace officers. Would the legendary Reaper consider teaching his methods to younger men? Samuel Morrison looked older now, his hair completely white and his face marked by deeper lines, but his pale gray eyes still held their piercing intelligence. "I don't teach killing, Marshal," he said finally, "but I might consider teaching justice." The Marshal Training Academy operated out of a converted barn on the edge of town, where Samuel taught precision shooting, tactical thinking, and most importantly, the moral weight of taking human life. His students learned to see their guns as tools of last resort, not instruments of glory. "Every kill changes you," he would tell them, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. "Every justified shot is necessary, but necessary doesn't mean easy. You'll carry every face, remember every name, and some nights you'll wonder if there was another way. That doubt is what keeps you human." The Academy produced some of the finest lawmen in territorial history, men who understood that true strength came from restraint rather than aggression. They carried Samuel's philosophy across the frontier: exhaust every option before drawing your weapon, but when you draw, be absolutely certain of your target and your cause. 10 years after Black Jack's death, Samuel Morrison was diagnosed with lung fever, the legacy of too many years breathing gunpowder smoke and desert dust. He faced his illness with the same calm acceptance he had shown every other challenge in his violent life. Marshal Fletcher, now sheriff of Dodge City, visited him regularly during his final months. The young lawman had become a fine peace officer under Samuel's guidance, maintaining order through respect rather than fear. "You did good work here, Sheriff," Samuel said during one of their last conversations. "This town is proof that violence can end, that peace is possible when good men stand watch." 20 years after the famous gunfight, Sheriff Fletcher stood beside a marble headstone in Dodge City Cemetery, reading the inscription aloud to his young deputy. "Samuel Morrison, 18171-897, the Reaper who found peace. Beloved teacher, faithful friend, servant of justice. Tell me again about the day he faced Black Jack's gang," the deputy requested, and Fletcher smiled at the familiar request. Every lawman in 3 territories knew the story, but it bore repeating as both legend and lesson. He gave them every chance to walk away. Fletcher began, his voice carrying the reverence of a man recounting scripture. but they chose violence over wisdom, pride over survival. In 15 minutes of gunfighting, Samuel Morrison proved that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, and that some men are born to stand between the innocent and the evil that would destroy them. A young federal marshal approached the grave, carrying fresh flowers and wearing the silver badge of his office. He knelt and placed the bouquet beside the headstone, then spoke quietly to the memory of the man who had trained him. "The academy is still running, Marshal Morrison. 43 graduates this year. All of them taught your way. The frontier is getting safer because of what you started here, because you showed us that the gun is the servant, not the master." As the sun set over Dodge City, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the legend of the Reaper lived on in the men he had trained and the peace he had helped establish. Samuel Morrison had found his redemption not in retirement from violence, but in ensuring that the next generation understood the true cost of taking life and the sacred duty of protecting it. His legacy was written not in the 43 men he had killed, but in the countless lives saved by lawmen who had learned to value justice over speed, mercy over vengeance, and peace over the temporary satisfaction of violence. The Reaper of Dodge City had finally found his rest, but his work would continue as long as good men were willing to stand watch against the darkness. If you enjoyed this tale of justice, redemption, and the true cost of violence, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American frontier. We bring you tales of courage, sacrifice, and the complicated heroes who shaped our nation's history. Until next time, may justice guide your path and peace guard your rest.